Hello and welcome to another update. In this one, we'll be starting out around the Kherson front line, and that is because we see that there is an ongoing artillery duel across the Dnieper River. Although it is very wide for a river, it is not that far of a distance, so the artillery have a clear shot across the river, which means that they are heavily focusing their fire on opponent positions on the river banks, especially Russian side on Kherson city and Ukrainian side on Novakhovka. Moving on to the Zaporizhzhia front, there hasn't been any updates other than a few rumors that there is some fighting ongoing that has started, but there's been no confirmation of anything, so I'm just glossing over it. In the Donetsk front, the fighting is ongoing around Marinka. There's been no updates here in the south. However, since there's been no updates, I'll just report it as nothing has happened. But Marinka's the fighting is ongoing. As for the Pitsky front, the Peromaiska and Vodyan and Opitny fighting is ongoing. And the Nevelske front has reached 1.5 kilometers from the village itself, which means that the Russians are advancing and closing in on it. Further north around the Bakhmut front, there's been no updates. I'll take it as the fighting is still ongoing, as there's been no confirmation that it has been pulled back or anything else. So I'll just leave it as is. Moving on to the northern front around the Luhansk front, this is where we've received the most updates. The Ukrainians started an offensive around the east of Makivka. There's been no direct target reported so far, but it could be either Blashenka, which is most likely. It is this village here that is the only village between Makivka and Nevsky and the highway between Kreminna and Svatove, which are these two main cities here. And by cutting that in half, they'll be cutting off the main supply route between the two cities. So that could also be the target, to just go around the villages, as there's this far distance, about 10 to 15 kilometers between them, which will allow them to just pass through. However, most likely the Russians have positions around these valleys and these forest lines to prevent a Ukrainian advance. Other than that, there's been a lot of reports of fighting here in this area specifically, and although there's a gap in the fighting between the north and the south here, there is a lot of UAV recon being reported in this whole front line, which means that the Ukrainians are most likely planning a large-scale offensive here. However, with the current situation, I've actually looked at the military deployment map from militaryland.net. We see that the Ukrainians have a very large concentration of forces here in the south. Almost all of their forces are here. I estimate around 80%, considering the large concentration, and most of these are brigade sites, while the ones throughout the country are mostly regiments or less. There are a bunch of brigades as well. However, the large concentration, if we zoom in, we see that there is a lot of forces here in the south, specifically around the Donetsk and Luhansk fronts, but also a whole bunch around Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. And with the latest RIPAR reporting stating that the Ukrainian forces around Kherson leaving and relocating to Zaporizhzhia, that would leave about 60% of Ukrainian forces here in the southeast, which means that there's a very large concentration of Ukrainian forces here. This most likely indicates that the Ukrainians are planning to go on an all-out offensive, possibly here in the winter, which is why we are seeing the West advocate for a ceasefire or a stalemate of the war throughout the winter, to do some sort of information campaign to lower the Russian guard that the Ukrainians aren't able to conduct any winter offensives, but that is actually their plan. However, this also comes at a very high risk. If the Russians manage to do a large-scale offensive operation, then they would be able to do what the Western media have been saying that they could do for many, many months, and that is to attack from the east towards Poltava, as well as from the south towards Dnipro. And if we look at my map and look at the supply lines, we'll see that by taking Dnipro and Poltava, they'll be cutting off all Ukrainian supply lines to the south. This would mean a complete encirclement of most of Ukraine's army. However, that would have to go through most of Ukraine's army. So depending on their success with that, they could also be doing their large-scale air campaign that I have been talking about for months as well. Looking at the reports from the Russian Air Force the past couple of months, there isn't a lot of combat operations. However, there is a load of training operations where we see multiple planes flying together, training together, and also single missions. And most likely that means that the Russian forces didn't have enough pilots that are well enough trained to actually do a large-scale air campaign at the start of the war. But now they're preparing one and they're trying to cram it in as fast as possible. So they're doing constant flying, which is why we've seen multiple planes crash within Russia. And this means that they're planning a large-scale air campaign. Now, what would a large-scale air campaign be most efficient at? And looking at the Russian playbook so far, we see that there are two possible things, and possibly both of them. First one is destroying the Ukrainian energy grid completely, destroying all of their electric power plants and so on. And the second one is destroying the bridges across the Dnieper River. If they destroy the bridges around Kiev and Cherkasy and Kremenchuk, and they take Zaporizhzhia and Dnipro, then the Ukrainians will be stuck on the right bank of the Dnieper River, the western bank of the Dnieper River. With this, the Ukrainians will be in a position where over half of the army is encircled in the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, which would leave them without supply, and that would be fatally catastrophic for the Ukrainian army. With the mobilization of Russian troops, as well as their active soldiers and their mercenaries and so on, they will have a large enough force to take advantage of this supply cut of the Ukrainian forces. And if they cannot manage to take Dnipro and Zaporizhzhia, they can also blow these bridges. So either way, they have a way of completely cutting supply across the Dnieper River. With this, they would force the Ukrainians to either invade Belarus to go around the river, or to somehow do a very large-scale naval operation, which they cannot do, because that would require way too much transports and equipment and many other things that they do not have available right now. So by blowing the bridges across the Dnieper River, Russia entered a position with a huge advantage that cannot be ignored, and that would leave over half of Ukraine's army extremely vulnerable. And at the same time, if they manage to take control over half of the Ukrainian army and then invade through Belarus towards Lviv, then they can cut off Western supply to Ukraine, and then Ukraine's army could collapse. So what does the Ukraine need the most right now? They need air defense in case of a large air-scale campaign. They need to be able to completely defend all of their bridges across the Dnieper River. Without those, they have no supply to the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. That's it for this video. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.